Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the ITNA Endorsed Webmaster Series 2021 with the Pediatric Glomerular Disease Symposium. Today, we have entered into webinar 9, and the highlight of the program is we have the polling session today. And this program is spanning from May 22nd to July 14th. So today we have two eminent speakers, Dr. Manisha Sagai and Dr. Aditi Sinha. Dr. Aditi Sinha will be joining a little late. The first speaker for the day is Dr. Manisha Sagai. So Dr. Manisha Sagai is a professor and head Department of Nephrology at Osmania Medical College, Hyderabad. And she is a vice president of Indian Society of Nephrology. And she is also an editor-in-chief for the prestigious journal, Indian Journal of Transplantation. And she is a council member of International Society of Nephrology. She holds various posts. She is also a chairman of South Asia Regional Board, and she is executive committee member of Indian Society of Organ Transplant. She has received more than 13 gold medals, and she is a national gold medalist in nephrology for the year 2003. She has more than 100 publications, and she is also an examiner for DM and DNB MCI. We expect over to Dr. Manisha Sagai to deliver her lecture on COVID-19 and glomerular disease. Over to Manisha, ma'am.
So thank you, Dr. Kalavani, for this opportunity. I thank ITNA for this opportunity. It's an honor to be a part of this symposium, and it's a privilege to speak in a session where Dr. Nammalwar is one of the chairpersons. So, I mean, he has been a mentor, guru. So thank you very much. The pleasure is all mine. So today I'll be talking about the management of glomerular disease in COVID-19 pandemic, why this topic is important. We know that immunosuppression and antiproteinuric measures are cornerstones of treatment in renal disease. And immunosuppression was one of the most common underlying conditions in a report on 345 children with COVID-19. So the children who developed COVID-19, the underlying factor in most of them was immunosuppression. So this topic is really important. So who are immunosuppressed? So most of our children with glomerular disease are immunocompromised because they are on one medication or the other. So those children who are on corticosteroids, either prednisone, methylprednisolone, or dexamethasone, they are considered immunosuppressed. If they have been on prednisone more than 20 milligram per day for more than 4 weeks in the last 6 months, or more than 5 milligram per day for more than 4 weeks with one or more other immunosuppressive agent in the last 6 months. So this defines most of the children with nephrotic syndrome. Then those children who are on calcium inhibitors, those on mycophenolate mofetil, azathioprine, cyclophosphamide, rituximab. So you can see that even a single dose of cyclophosphamide or rituximab in the last 6 months, they are immunosuppressed. And in addition, plasma exchange in the preceding 6 weeks. So most of the children who are having glomerular disease and undergoing treatment, whether they are having nephrotic syndrome or glomerulonephritis, are immunosuppressed. So I have divided my topic in 4 sections. As a pediatric nephrologist or as pediatricians, when will you encounter children with glomerular disease? You can have 4 scenarios. The first can be in the times of COVID pandemic, a child comes to you and you diagnose a glomerular disease for the first time in the child. This could be a first scenario. The child is COVID negative, but it's important because he has come to you during times of COVID pandemic, and how do you diagnose and how do you treat is important. The second scenario can be you have children whom you have put on maintenance immunosuppression for glomerulonephritis, and they come to you during COVID pandemic. What do you advise them? How do you manage them? What do you do about the immunosuppression? The third scenario could be the child had glomerulonephritis, was on treatment, but now becomes COVID positive. So the first 2 scenarios, the child is not COVID positive, but he has come to you in COVID pandemic. The last 2 scenarios are where the child is COVID positive. The third scenario is any glomerulonephritis child has become COVID positive. And the last is the child was previously healthy, but developed COVID-19 and developed renal disease because of COVID-19 and comes to you. So what are you going to do? So these are the 4 clinical scenarios which you'll be encountering, and I hope to answer all the questions. So the broad line, the 2 questions facing us in any of these scenarios would be, can we do a biopsy or should we do a biopsy? And should we do immunosuppressive therapy? So these are the 2 questions all of us will have in our minds when we treat glomerulonephritis patients in COVID pandemic. So we start with an example. 13 years old child comes to you with history of rash, hematuria, hypertension, and oliguria. So clinical diagnosis is a nephritic syndrome. And definitely this child is probably having a glomerular involvement, the way the history is given, hematuria, hypertension. The CV shows 3+ protein, creatinine is 2.3 milligram per DL, ultrasound normal size kidneys, ANA is negative, dsDNA is negative, ASO is negative, complement is low, and ANCA is negative. What do you do? So do you have a diagnosis with these lab parameters? You do not have a clear-cut diagnosis with these lab parameters. So what should you do? Should you biopsy or should you not biopsy? So indications of renal biopsy in COVID pandemic: if the biopsy is non-urgent, if the renal biopsy is not likely to modify the patient's outcome, or if there is a high pretest probability for a particular diagnosis without a biopsy, then we should manage empirically. So what does the second statement mean? If the ANCA is positive in this child, for instance, then you can go ahead with the treatment before proceeding with the biopsy. So if you have the diagnosis without the biopsy based on serology, then no need to do a biopsy in this COVID pandemic times. Or if the biopsy does not modify treatment, there is no need to go ahead with a biopsy. These non-urgent biopsies should be subsequently performed once the local risk of COVID-19 infection is low or after failure of empiric treatment. So do you think this child falls into this category? Most definitely not, because she has some glomerular disease, creatinine is high, she needs a biopsy because we do not know the diagnosis. We do not know whether we have to give immunosuppression or not. So she comes in this indication. So we suggest that a renal biopsy should be performed if it is reasonably likely to impact clinical decision making. Example, RPGN, small vessel vasculitis, acute interstitial nephritis, or steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome, where you do not have a clear-cut diagnosis. You are suspecting this, but you do not have a clear-cut diagnosis. For example, in our patient, none of the seromarkers is positive apart from complement being low. And this is from a paper from Dr. Anil Vasudevan and the Pediatric Nephrology Working Group, published in 2020. Biopsies that are necessary and have therapeutic implications, they should be done. And those for less emergent indications, for example, steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome, calcineurin toxicity, or persistent hematuria, may be delayed. So what is the bottom line? Renal biopsies are not contraindicated. If you don't have a diagnosis, please do the renal biopsy. So this patient biopsy was done and it showed class 4 lupus nephritis with high activity and low chronicity scoring. What do you do? So what are the broad principles of management of a newly diagnosed glomerulonephritis in era of COVID pandemic? We know that we need to give immunosuppressive therapy for these children. So what guidelines do we follow? So there are important guidelines which need to be looked at. One is this Canadian guideline. This was for adult nephrology group. There is another guideline from the American group published by Bombach in CJASN. We should be aware of these guidelines. They are very nice guidelines. We have made Indian guidelines. I was also part of these guidelines, and they included both children and adults. And this was published in Indian Journal of Nephrology last year. Then again, Canadian group has given a pediatric glomerulonephritis guideline. NephCure has given in Kidney International another guideline, and this is the guideline from Pediatric Nephro Group, headed by Dr. Anil Vasudevan, for Indian Society of Pediatric Nephrology. It's now called the Indian Society of Pediatric Nephrology. My apologies, we don't call it Pediatric Working Group now. So this is from ISPN. So these are the guidelines which form the basis of my talk. So coming to that patient, new diagnosed glomerular disease, we can have either a SLE nephritis like we have in this patient, it might be IRGN, it might be some vasculitis, anti-GBM, so on and so forth. Nephrotic syndrome, another group what we encounter, minimal change, FSGS, membranous IG, so on and so forth. So now in this example, most of these need immunosuppressive therapy, whether they are glomerulonephritis or nephrotic syndrome. So we need to give steroids or some form of induction therapy, especially for the glomerulonephritis, RPGN, and nephrotic we need to give mostly the steroids and then other therapies. So what drugs are we talking about? Methylprednisolone, prednisolone, cyclophosphamide, mycophenolate, CA9, rituximab, azathioprine, levamisole, and plasmapheresis also. So these are the therapies which we use in the initial phase. For this patient, we might be needing to use these therapies as a part of induction therapy for lupus nephritis. So what should we do? Should we go ahead with the immunosuppression? So the guidelines says, all the guidelines say that newly diagnosed patients should be managed on their own merit. They should receive pneumococcal vaccine to reduce the chances of secondary pneumococcal pneumonia. The response to the vaccine may be low, but still they should be vaccinated. The children, this child, should be given induction therapy, but they should be triaged before any infusion to exclude symptoms. So find out whether the child has symptoms, fever, respiratory distress, loose motions, rule out an active COVID infection. So triage. If the child has COVID infection, we will handle in the last part of my talk when I said we will be dealing with COVID positive children. Here we are dealing with COVID negative children in COVID pandemic. So triage, plan an infusion. The second question is, should we do RT-PCR for COVID before induction if there is no suspicion? So there is no policy, but in some of the guidelines, it's recommended that if you are planning rituximab or if you are planning methylprednisolone, it might be good to give do the RT-PCR test before giving the induction therapy. And this is mentioned in the Canadian pediatric guidelines. Though the other guidelines do not mention doing this test every time. What should be the medication? Standard induction medication is recommended. So no need to alter unless there is some specific indication. So this child can be given IV therapy, can be given infusion. RT-PCR, we did the RT-PCR before giving induction, but it is not a policy. You can follow your site-specific policy, and standard induction medicine should be given. So during IV infusion of cyclophosphamide or methylprednisolone, social distancing. So your beds in the ward should be separated by at least 2 meters. The patients, the children, more than 5 years, they have to wear the masks. Staff has to wear the mask. Frequently decontaminate all equipment and surfaces, which we know now, and inform the patients and post signs in your unit about appropriate social behavior. Screen the staff also. The staff should not infect the child. The child should not infect the staff. So these are the guidelines for infusions as recommended by Bombach et al. In article JASN 2020. What about mycophenolate? So mycophenolate as induction therapy. We know that SLE can be treated by cyclophosphamide, can be treated by mycophenolate as well. So generally, when the indication is clear-cut, we continue antimetabolites for induction therapy. In this case, they can be given. But do not use metabolites for some doubtful indications. If the patient is completely asymptomatic, the GFR is stable, do not give therapy for marginal criteria or non-standard indications. For example, a stable nephrotic child, frequently relapsing, do not think of starting mycophenolate-like therapies, at least in the COVID pandemic era, but give when the glomerulonephritis is severe as a part of induction therapy. What about rituximab? Suppose this child doesn't respond. Will you use rituximab for induction? So remember, if rituximab is used, child may not develop antibodies to SARS-CoV. Even if the child develops COVID infection, the antibodies won't develop and the child would be at a risk of reinfection. And in those given vaccine, whenever the vaccine is available, the response to vaccine is poor, as has been demonstrated in adult population. So the bottom line is, as there is no experience that how COVID infection would behave during rituximab therapy, it will be wise to avoid rituximab in this uncertain situation. So it's not absolutely contraindicated, but there are very few indications of giving rituximab in this pandemic. So there is one paper on Indian experience from PGI Chandigarh. This was adult paper. And here, SLE, lupus nephritis, active disease like our case, they have given steroids. Yeah, they have managed with all the recommended drugs for induction therapy, and they found no side effects if the patient was handled properly. Their patients were also COVID negative, but they have gotten admitted for severe SLE during COVID pandemic. And they have also said that maybe SLE and COVID, maybe SLE, the immunotolerance protects them from being affected by coronavirus. This is what they said. And in immunosuppressed SLE patients, generally there is absence of excessive inflammation. They are mostly on HCQs. So probably SLE patients do not have a severe COVID infection. That's what the paper said. What about plasmapheresis? Some people, severe lupus nephritis, or those with cerebral lupus, or those with vasculitis, anti-GBM, they may need plasmapheresis. If we go ahead, the plasmapheresis depletes the antibodies. Child becomes immunosuppressed for 6 weeks post-plasmapheresis. But if it is indicated, if the child's renal disease is severe, it can be given. It's permitted. It's not absolutely contraindicated. So what did I say about the first section? We are handling a child with newly diagnosed glomerulonephritis. And what did I conclude? That you can do a biopsy if required. If you don't get a diagnosis without biopsy, please go ahead. Go ahead with the standard therapy. Nothing is contraindicated, but try to avoid rituximab as far as possible. Giving IV infusions can be done following the standard social distancing protocols. Now, the second scenario where the child is already on immunosuppression, he is on your follow-up, he or she is on your follow-up, and now you need to advise the child on immunosuppressive therapy during COVID pandemic. The child is not COVID positive. Again, these are the drugs which we use for immunosuppression maintenance, whether it is a glomerulonephritis or most of the nephrotic children would be on these medications. So what do we do? So there was initial one school of thought saying the lower doses should be used. 50% drop in cumulative doses should be done. But this is now no longer followed. It is said in the Canadian Society of Nephrology guidelines as well as our own Indian guidelines, the glomerular disease patients who started immunosuppressive therapy prior to the pandemic require a risk-benefit assessment. And it is suggested that significant treatment reductions or changes should be deferred until post-pandemic to mitigate the risk of disease relapse. So they say that if you reduce the stable immunosuppression in an asymptomatic child, you will precipitate a relapse and you will have to give more severe immunosuppression. Bottom line, continue the maintenance therapy in most of the cases unless there is a clear-cut indication to stop it. So if doing well and not COVID positive, continue maintenance medications unless directed otherwise. The immunosuppressive therapy needs to be reviewed on a case-to-case basis, balancing acute relapse against the risk of effect of COVID-19. The children on long-term glucocorticoids should not stop this abruptly and continue HCQ as it affords some protection against COVID-19. Some other suggestions are IV infusions can be changed to oral. So if equivalent oral induction regime exists, that can be done. For example, in patients of lupus nephritis, ELNT protocol or NIH protocol can be changed to oral cyclophosphamide or mycophenolate. IV pulse methyl can be treated. The patients on IV pulse, the children, can be treated with oral prednisolone or oral methylprednisolone. Even vasculitis children can be switched over from IV to oral. So this is one school of thought. If the patient is not able to come, child is not able to come, or you don't want the child to come to your COVID designated hospital, IV infusions can be changed to oral. What about CNIs? CNIs are safe drugs and they can be continued without any dose reduction for maintenance, as this has been clearly shown from a lot of data from transplant recipients. So CNIs, they are generally continued safely. What about metabolites, antimetabolites, MMF or azathioprine? Here also, you can continue them in face of COVID pandemic, provided the child is not COVID positive. He has just come to you in times of COVID. So you can continue. And in some papers, it said that if sustained remission has been there for more than 12 months, you can consider discontinuation of antimetabolites. But this is the decision from the unit. We generally continue the maintenance immunosuppression with MMF or azathioprine. What about rituximab as maintenance? So rituximab maintenance therapies can be used, delaying intervals between rituximab infusions. If the risk of disease progression or flare is low, you can delay, you can increase the gap between the infusions. Lower doses may be considered as given evidence from Maindritz study suggesting equivalent efficacy. But having said that, again, the bottom line is, as there is not much experience on how COVID-19 infection could behave, it is wise to avoid rituximab in uncertain situations. So though it's not absolutely contraindicated, be very wary of using the drug. Use it only if nothing else is. And along with the immunosuppression, continue supportive care, continue ACE inhibitors or ARBs. continue prophylactic antibiotics, the trimethoprim, sulfamethoxazole, encourage social distancing, encourage use of masks while outside the house, and complete the course of vaccine, influenza, pneumococcal vaccine. As I said, the responses may be poor, but again, you have good responses. We immunize the transplant recipients. You all know that. We immunize the nephrotic children, though they are immunosuppressed. So same guidelines are followed, that when the child is on lower doses of immunosuppression, the child can be vaccinated. The guidelines are not different in pandemic era. Now, should we call these patients who are on maintenance therapy to the hospital? So if the patient is stable, no respiratory distress, the saturations are above 94. In another pediatric guideline, it's above 92. And if the child does not meet any admission criteria, no respiratory distress, no signs of severe or critical COVID, then you can do home monitoring. Under home monitoring, we should not use the term loosely. There should be clear-cut guidelines of home monitoring. Home monitoring means the children should have, the parents should have urine dipstick. That should be tested. They should maintain a record of that. The blood draws can be done at home, depending on the nature of the disease. The parents should be able to monitor the weight, blood pressure, and height also in children. And any sort of protocol biopsies, which we have been doing in the non-COVID era, should be definitely postponed. So home monitoring, so it's not just that you just monitor the child at home. These instructions should be given, and urine examination, height, weight, blood pressure, and blood draws if required. These are the 5 tenets of home monitoring. And the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India, March 2020, they have allowed video consults for the first time. But video consults we should not take lightly. We should develop a standard script of recommendations for patients calling in questions about COVID and glomerulonephritis. So we should have a standard so that we don't forget answering all those questions. And the CDC guidelines also include that instead of a phone call, it's better to make a video call. And the patients should be telephoned before this to keep the blood and urine tests ready, to prepare their current medication list. So in Indian patients, most of them, the parents, if they are not educated, they can still take a WhatsApp and send the picture of the old prescription, your prescription on WhatsApp. That helps. And 90% of Indian population is able to do it. Because otherwise, if they try to read out the prescriptions, it's very difficult. You have your own prescription, which you had given them last time, and it's easy to send them a revised prescription. So they should be ready when the video call comes. So perform the blood pressure readings, weight readings, the urine test reports. They should. So the video call is acceptable, but should be done in a systematic manner, just not picking up the phone and just calling and asking, how are you? So that should be followed. Now, in case the child wants to come for a clinic visit, or you want to see the child, then again, protocols are there. They, before the child is brought to the clinic by the attendants, one phone call to find out, pre-screening, phone call pre-screening, whether the child or parent, they have symptoms of COVID. If yes, then they are not asked to come, or they have to go to another area, COVID designated facility. They should come by prior appointment. The time in the clinic or hospital should be minimized. So we can ask the family to wait in the vehicle till their turn comes. And inside the clinic also, masks, social distance, all those things should be followed. And there should be frequent cleaning of the contaminated surfaces in the clinic. The children and the caregivers should ensure that 4 weeks, at least 4 weeks of stock of medicines is kept at home. They should contact their treating pediatrician, hospital by phone or email if any symptoms develop. It's very important that we should give them a single number. So those people who are under your follow-up, please give them the number of your secretary or clerk or whosoever, so that they have a one-point contact for all their appointments and for all their queries. So this was our article which got published in Kidney International Report, that COVID pandemic, apart from the adverse effects of COVID itself, affected the care of other patients also. All patients of kidney disease in India got affected because of the scare and all, because of the systems which were not in place. Many of the patients lost lives because of non-availability of medicine, not able to contact the doctor, not because of COVID, but because of non-COVID reasons, and this should be avoided. So the second section of my talk I have finished, and what did I say for maintenance therapy? Continue maintenance therapy in all glomerulonephritis children, whether nephrotic, whether RPGN, with minor adjustments. Home management is preferable. social vaccine is important. Social vaccine means mask, social distance, and frequent hand hygiene. Avoid rituximab if possible and convert IV to oral whenever possible. Individualize. So you are the best judge of your patient and you have to individualize therapy. So we have discussed about induction therapy and maintenance therapy. Now the third important section is our patients, glomerulonephritis patients whom we are already treating. We have induced them, they are on maintenance therapy. That child develops COVID. What do we do? So in this case, again, we do not panic. We advise the family not to panic. If the child is stable, show social distance, face mask, hand wash, even at home, surface sanitization, vaccination of the attendant, and monitoring. We all know saturations, temperature, vitals. These should be monitored. So this goes without saying. At home, what do we do? If the child is positive and needs immunosuppressive medications, should the child be allowed to continue immunosuppression in the face of COVID positivity? So in patients who are COVID-19 positive, the nephrologist may consider modifying maintenance immunosuppression regimes on a case-to-case basis. So MMF may be stopped, tacrolimus can be continued, and corticosteroids can be continued. And we are well aware that, in fact, if the child is not on steroids and develops COVID positive, there is a role of stress dose of steroids for management of COVID. So the basic difference from non-COVID positive patients is that generally the antimetabolites are stopped. Either the dose is reduced or they are stopped altogether, whereas CNIs and steroids can continue as before. If the child is sick enough and gets hospitalized, again, the antimetabolites are held. They are started on stress dose of corticosteroids in the hospital, and CNIs can be continued either in the same dose or reduced dose, and rituximab is definitely avoided. So what does literature say about these sick children who got hospitalized, glomerulonephritis? What were the outcomes? So these are reports. They say that the children who present with the glomerulonephritis and develop COVID, they are also treated. They can be treated well. And in some cases, even prophylactic anticoagulation was given in the hospital. Steroid therapy was started once the child was stable. In this case, they have started after 48 hours of antibiotic therapy. And another data from 18 immunosuppressed children with COVID-19, they said these children had glomerular disease, ANCA, atypical HUS. So majority, though they were admitted to the hospital, only 20% needed supplemental oxygen and none required intensive care unit admission or died, and most of them recovered. So it is said that COVID does not cause that much severe disease in immunosuppressed children in contrast to other viruses. So the outcomes have been pretty okay. They are not dismal. The fourth part of my talk is the child is perfectly healthy, but now he comes to you because the child has developed glomerulonephritis because of COVID-19. So can COVID-19 infection itself cause glomerulonephritis? So we have several studies on this. And in this article from AJKD, a multi-center clinico-pathological correlation of renal biopsies performed in COVID-19 patients presenting with AKI or proteinuria. And it was shown that this study covered 7 large referral centers in US, and they had 9 females and 8 males. 14 had native kidney biopsy. 82% had mild COVID symptoms, cough, fatigue, etc. The kidney disease manifested within 1 week of acquiring COVID-19 infection. And the indication for biopsy was AKI in 88% and in 65% proteinuria. Some of them had AKI and proteinuria. And what were the predominant findings on biopsy? Acute tubular injury. This was most common, seen in 88%. Collapsing glomerulopathy. This is very important. This was seen in around 40%. And thrombotic microangiopathy in another 35%. So this procoagulant state, cytokine storm, this may lead to renal damage in COVID-19. And in the biopsies, the COVID particles were not demonstrated in all the biopsies. So it's not very clear where whether the COVID directly caused kidney injury or whether it is a part of cytokine storm. So even with mild COVID-19 disease, the patients can present with AKI and or proteinuria. Collapsing glomerulopathy and thrombotic microangiopathy are frequently seen, and they can lead to irreversible injury requiring dialysis. So this was from American Journal of Kidney Diseases. And in another article published in JASN 2020, here 17 patients with COVID-19 had again native biopsies, Columbia University, and here what they found, podocytopathy was seen in the form of collapsing glomerulopathy in 5, minimal change disease in 1. Among immune-mediated glomerular diseases, membranous glomerulopathy was seen in 2. This was FLA2R associated. Lupus nephritis class 4+5 in 1. Anti-GBM nephritis is 1. Tubulointerstitial disease in 4. All of them had acute tubular injury. And again, they had done the biopsies in transplants as well. So they concluded that COVID-19 can cause a wide spectrum of glomerular and tubular abnormalities. And most of them showed that direct viral infection of the kidney was unlikely. And the major pathomechanism was cytokine-mediated effects and heightened adaptive immune responses. So we understand that COVID-19 can itself cause damage to the kidney because of its predilection for causing cytokine storm. So this was another article published where they had again studied COVID-19 associated AKI and done renal biopsies with pretty much the same results. So summarizing these biopsy studies, the most common picture we see is ATN or in fact ATI, acute tubular injury. TMA is common. Among glomerulonephritis, immune complex glomerulonephritis, necrotizing glomerulonephritis, collapsing GN, any other glomerulonephritis can also be seen. And interestingly, there are some reports of glomerulonephritis and COVID-19 vaccination as well. So coming to some of the reports published on immune complex glomerulonephritis after COVID-19 infection, this was published again in KI reports from Sanjeev Sethi's group. And what did they say? The immune complex glomerulonephritis after COVID-19 infection is like somewhat akin to HIV-like immune complex glomerulonephritis. It has lupus-like features, HIV-like features. There is polyclonal B-cell activation. There may be full house immune deposits in the biopsy. And how did they treat these patients? The patients were treated again similar to any other immune complex glomerulonephritis with a severe presentation. Methylprednisolone was given, followed by oral prednisolone. And in fact, here they had used oral mycophenolate mofetil as a part of treatment. Then there was another report published in Pediatric Nephrology on acute necrotizing glomerulonephritis associated with COVID-19 infection. And they were not able to conclude whether it was coincidental or causative. Virus was not detected in the renal tissue. And these children were also treated with steroids and had a good outcome. So we have talked about a variety of lesions. Now there is another interesting article about COVID glomerulonephritis. And the topic of this article is interesting. COVAN is the new HIVAN. So this article states that there is re-emergence of collapsing glomerulopathy in patients with COVID-19. And it manifests just like HIVAN, HIV-associated collapsing glomerulopathy, exactly like that. Here, it's more common in those patients who have APOL1 gene. So this APOL1 gene we know is very common in Africans. It's not very common in our Indian population. But this is a very important predisposing factor. And the virus acts as a second hit. It is acquired as after a viral respiratory illness, cytokine storm occurs. There is increased systemic interferons and chemokines. And this causes increased transcription of APOL1 variant. And there is disruption of podocyte, autophagy, and there is de-differentiation of podocytes and parietal cells. So you can see the collapsing glomerulopathy occurring there with collapse of the glomerular vasculature, proliferation, hypertrophy of the mesangial cells. The podocytes, the parietal epithelial cells are getting hypertrophied, and the podocytes themselves have become huge. So collapsing globulopathy, which is similar to HIVAN. So now we have another entity called COVAN as regards COVID and collapsing globulopathy. Then this is another report, as I mentioned. So apart from TME, apart from acute tubular injury, apart from glomerulonephritis associated with COVID, is COVID-19 vaccination, is that at fault? So there is a report where it was mentioned in Kidney International, report of macroscopic hematuria occurring hours following the coronavirus disease vaccination in patients with known IgA nephropathy. And they also reported 2 previously healthy individuals who presented with macroscopic hematuria shortly after COVID vaccination and were subsequently diagnosed with IgN and crescentic glomerulonephritis respectively. So it may be causal, it may be coincidental, we don't know. It might be coincidental for all we know, and we need further studies on this aspect. So what about the vaccines available? In adults, we have all these 4 vaccines. In children now, at least vaccination has started with mRNA vaccine for children. That is one thing, and it's not started in our country so far. But again, as pediatricians, as pediatric nephrologists, we have heard that the 3rd wave may be a pediatric wave, but still we should be familiar with the vaccines, and we should also be familiar with the use of these vaccines in children. There is no contraindication to giving vaccines in children. Only thing, we need more data, and so many studies are being done, and time is not far off that we will have vaccination open for the pediatric population as well. It's already started in US. So we should be aware of COVID-19 vaccine, whether we can give it to glomerulonephritis children. As I said, yes. Nephrotic children, yes. Follow the same vaccination guidelines as you follow for the other vaccinations. So I have discussed these 4 aspects. I have discussed a child with newly diagnosed glomerular disease in COVID pandemic, child with maintenance immunosuppression in COVID pandemic, child with glomerulonephritis on treatment becoming COVID positive, and child previously healthy but now developing glomerulonephritis because of COVID-19. And what we have learned is we can do any intervention, for example, a biopsy, if it is indicated, if it changes treatment decisions. Can we give immunosuppression? Should we give immunosuppression? These are the 2 questions we wanted to answer. Yes. The decision is case-based. Overall, try to avoid rituximab if not mandatory. Shift from IV to oral wherever possible. Stop MMF if the child with glomerulonephritis turns COVID positive. CNIs and steroids can be continued in a patient with COVID positive illness. So all these are summed up nicely in that article by Bombach et al. JASN 2020, where they have discussed immunosuppression, they have discussed diagnosis and monitoring, supportive care, and the telehealth. And I end my talk by saying we are all learning about COVID-19 in children as well. COVID-19 and glomerulonephritis, we are seeing more and more cases. In adults, we have seen in children also COVID-19 and glomerulonephritis, and the best way to learn is to have a registry to document all these cases. And this is already, started in the international arena, and I think we develop a network and start a glomerulonephritis registry. So we learn more and more from our experience of COVID-19 and glomerulonephritis management in children. And that's the best way to learn. Thank you very much for a patient hearing.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for covering all the practical aspects of glomerular disease in the current pandemic of COVID-19. It was an excellent practical approach talk. Thank you so much, ma'am. And the next speaker is Dr. Aditi Sinha.
Mama, this actually wrong. There is another.
Dr. Aditi Sinha, you're there?
Yes, I'm here. Hi.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Aditi Sinha is Associate Professor, Division of Nephrology, Department of Pediatrics at prestigious All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. And her area of interest is towards pathogenesis and therapies of steroid-resistant and steroid-sensitive nephrotic syndrome. She is also interested in pathogenesis and outcome of hemolytic uremic syndrome. And she has received award, Dr. H.D. Dingley Memorial Award for her ICMR research in pediatrics in the year 2018. And she is also a junior representative of ICNA Council between the year 2014 to 2017. Over to Dr. Aditi to deliver her talk on Alport syndrome in children's. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Kalaivani, and thank you, Professor Namalwar, sir, and thank you to the group for inviting me to this session. It is a very hard task to follow through following Dr. Manisha Sahai's very energetic and full of information talk. And thank you, Dr. Sahai. It was very nice listening to you. I hope my slides are visible.
Visible. It's visible.
So essentially, Alport syndrome in children is a disease with very, very varied phenotype, which presents at any age. And in childhood, it is becoming increasingly recognized, and it is important to pick up the disease in childhood, and that is why it would be important to discuss this entity. In health and disease, collagen 4 alpha chains are very, very important. This small cartoon indicates a summary of how the collagen type 4 chains interact with each other in order to form protomers, which are trimers of 3 types of chains. And I think you are just going back to your pathology days and just trying to remember what these chains were comprised of. So you might remember that collagen 4 chains, alpha chains, are of 6 types, and the interaction of alpha 1, and alpha 2, that is 2 alpha 1 and 1 alpha 2 chain, together forms one particular type of protomer, whereas the interaction between alpha 1, alpha 4, and alpha 2, 4, and 5 forms a different types. And the interaction between 4, 5, and 6 would form a different type. Now, why are these important to know? Is because we know that this kind of collagen 4 is present in several tissues, in basement membrane location, in the skin, in the cochlea, in the kidneys, in 2 locations, just at the glomerular basement membrane, as well as in the capsule of the Bowman's capsule. And the presence of these chains in an correct fashion is very, very important. Now, as you can make out, these trimers are actually comprised of 3 portions. There's got a head and there's a tail. And this tail also has a different domain, which is the 7s domain at the very tail. And in between, there is just a triple helix, which is very, very important, as we will go about seeing. So in any basement membrane, this kind of triple helix structure, which is called a monomer, will then go on to interact with other triple helical structures at the head end, that is the NC1 trimer end, to form dimers. And you can see in the cartoon how they will then form tetramers. And this entire would form a lattice-like framework over the basement membrane of the tissue in which it is present. Now, what happens in disease is that if any of these collagen chains is not synthesized appropriately, what happens is that the monomer is not formed, because if even one of the 3 chains that are important, that are used to form this protomer, is not formed, then the triple helical structure cannot be generated. And if a triple helical structure cannot be generated, then the dimer and then the tetramer cannot be formed, and therefore the lattice-like structure of the basement membrane cannot be formed. And this is what happens in conditions such as Alport syndrome. For example, a mutation in the COL4A5 gene will lead to non-formation of the alpha 5 chain, and in the absence of the alpha 5 chain, the alpha 3 and alpha 4 chain do not have a third partner with which to interact to form the monomer, and therefore no such monomer, dimer, or tetramer is formed, and therefore there is loss of the basement membrane normal matrix. Now, if we go further, we can see that this is very, very important cartoon again to look at, which indicates how there is transition between the types of alpha chains from embryogenesis to adult times, or rather in a childhood. So what happens is that at first, the basement membrane in most of the locations in the tissues, such as the glomerular basement membrane, eyes, lungs, cochlea, skin, so smooth muscles, and esophagus, is formed of alpha 1, and alpha 2 chains. That is 2 alpha 1 chains and 1 alpha 2 chain. During embryogenesis, that is the type of type 4A collagen chains. However, a developmental switch occurs, and this developmental switch leads to the changeover to the alpha 3, alpha 4, alpha 5 kind of collagen chains in the glomerular basement membrane, cochlea, eyes, testes, and lungs. It also leads to the formation of alpha 5, and alpha 6 chains in the skin, esophagus, and smooth muscles. Now, this is sort of important to remember when you go on to talk about the types of mutations in collagen A4, collagen 4, A4, A5, A3, because depending on the location, the type of chain that will be altered will be important. For example, if there is a mutation in the collagen 4 A5 gene, it will lead to loss of the chain-like structure in both the glomerular basement membrane, also the cochlea and eyes, but also the skin. And this would be important as we go along. Now, why does this embryogenic change happen? It happens because the alpha 3, 4, 5 kind of alpha chain has more disulfide cross links, which makes it less susceptible to proteolysis than the alpha 1, alpha 2 trimers. And therefore, this type of collagen is more stable mechanically, as well as does not get lysed immediately. In absence of synthesis of alpha 3, 4, 5 or alpha 5, 5, 6, what happens is that there is persistence of the embryonic kind of collagen. However, this collagen is not that strong, and therefore, despite its persistence, it does not provide the same structure to the basement membrane as a typical 3, 4, 5 chain should. So there are many functions that collagen 4 alpha chains play. As you can see in this cartoon, there's the triple helical structure that is very clearly demonstrated in this cartoon. You can make out that the type 4 collagen has a trimer-like structure, which comprises of an NC1 end. At the NC1 end, it interacts with the other head of another monomer and then forms a dimer. But in the part of the chain, that is the chain part of it, those interact with certain receptors on the podocytes. So you have the glomerular basement membrane, which contains this collagen chains, and you have the podocytes, which have certain receptors, which could be DDR1, DDR2 receptors, or alpha 1, alpha beta, or integrins, that is alpha beta integrin 1 and 1 or 2 and 1. And these interact among each other and are important for certain signaling pathways to be active. In the absence of such an interaction, the podocyte signaling is impaired, and which leads to downstream changes such that various inflammatory cytokines are activated, as shown in this cartoon, TGF-beta, chemokines, tissue metalloproteinases, and these activated cytokines will lead to secondary changes of fibrosis, inflammation, leading to need for glomerular basement membrane repair. There could be segmental sclerosis, and these are all changes that will not happen, that will keep happening over a period of decades, such that end-stage renal kidney disease happens. Now, how can this be changed? To some extent, ACE inhibitors act on these inflammatory cytokines, as well as reducing glomerular hyperfiltration and thus reducing nephrosclerosis. So their impact has been shown in trials to be useful. So as you can make out on this image, you can see a normal podocyte structure. So this is just in transmission electron micrograph of a cut section of a filtration barrier. So you can make out with the white arrowheads, you can see that there is the normal slit diaphragms in between the interdigitating foot processes, and then there's the GBM. And you can see a distorted glomerular basement membrane, which has become thick and lamellated in structure. And on top of that, the podocytes overlying it are not at all neatly arranged with their interdigitating foot processes. Instead, they are all effaced, and proteinuria must most probably be occurring. So with that, we'll just come along to looking at what are the kinds of Alport syndrome there are. So there are chiefly 3 types of Alport syndrome, as you are all aware. There are 3 genes that are responsible for disease. The COL4A5 gene is the most common cause of Alport syndrome. As you can make out from this small table, almost 80 to 85% of cases of Alport syndrome are attributed to pathogenic variants in this gene. This is always X-linked inherited because the COL4A5 gene is present on the X chromosome. And most of these variants are very, very deleterious kind of variants in the gene. So they could be nonsense mutations, they could be frameshift mutations, etc. And what happens is that 85 to 90% of cases would require sequencing to pick them up. However, we also know that there could be other changes, such as duplications of some areas of the gene, or deletions, large deletions of some areas of the gene, which would not be possible to detect on sequencing alone sometimes and would require specialized analysis. On the other hand, there are two other forms of Alport syndrome, those caused by COL4A3 mutations and those caused by COL4A4 mutations. Now, both of these are known to be inherited as autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive types. The COL4A3 changes are slightly more common than the COL4A4 changes. But we also know that there is also evidence for digenic inheritance, which means that a person with autosomal recessive type of Alport syndrome might very well have on one allele a COL4A3 change and on the other allele a COL4A4 change, leading to the same phenotype but caused by mutations in two different genes. We also know that there is a specific form of Alport syndrome which is associated with leiomyomatosis, in which there is a deletion in the COL4A6. Now, COL4A6 is just adjacent to COL4A5, and we'll come to that shortly thereafter. Overall, 2/3 of all cases of Alport syndrome that we see would be X-linked inherited, and 20% would be autosomal dominant, and autosomal recessive cases would be 15% of cases. Now, overall, we do know that more than 500 variations have been described. However, we would not attribute pathogenicity to each and every change that gets described in the gene or genetic structure. We do know that we now have the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics classification system, which must be used to describe all variations that we see in the genomic structure, in the clinical exome, and we must choose only the pathogenic and likely pathogenic variants, and not the variants of unknown significance or the likely benign or benign changes while attributing pathogenicity. So whenever we order genetics for such patients with a clinical suspicion of Alport syndrome, it is very, very important to be clear on what we are attributing pathogenicity to, and when in doubt, always seek help from a clinical geneticist to understand better whether or not this indeed seems responsible for the phenotype. Many small deletions and insertions are described. So most of the pathogenic variants would be some such changes that would lead to either small deletion or insertion, or they would lead to a nonsense change, which means that the exon, wherever the change has happened, beyond that, the gene has not been transcribed. And that can happen if you have a frame shift being introduced or a splice site change being introduced. These would be the most common types of mutations that are responsible for the majority of cases of X-linked dominant disease, X-linked disease. However, missense mutations are also very common. When we say missense, what we mean is a single change at a single nucleotide. Those are also known to cause disease. There are no hotspots on the genes. This much we know now, that there are several changes. More than 500 variants are described in the COL4A5 alone, and there are no such hotspots. In the US, at least, they have identified 3 common mutations that they usually screen for before proceeding with large-scale sequencing. But for various reasons, which we'll come to shortly, it is most advisable to choose next-gen sequencing platforms for screening for genetic defects in these genes. COL4A3 and A4 genes are very, very large genes, and doing sequencing for them would not be a feasible exercise. Just simple Sanger sequencing would cost a lot and also will be a very tedious procedure prone to errors. Likewise, we also know that there are many genes that have phenotype which is mimicking Alport syndrome. For that reason, since you want to screen for several genes together and large areas, it is most advisable to go for clinical exome sequencing or next generation sequencing techniques of other kinds, which allow you to screen for several things together. And then if required, Sanger validation can be done. So there are recommendations on how to go about doing genetic testing, who to test for Alport syndrome, what platforms to use, what techniques to use, and how to go about attributing pathogenicity to a particular variation that you're finding in any of these genes. So people who are interested can look up this pediatric nephrology article, which was published 2 years back, to find out how next generation sequencing can be used and how classification happens for Alport syndrome. Overall, the gist is that we would use the guidelines recommend using next generation sequencing platform. They also recommend using the ACMG classification system to attribute pathogenicity, and they talk about how to test for patients in whom you have a high index of suspicion, but in whom you could not find anything on next gen sequencing, since 10 to 15% of cases are such that will not be detected by sequencing. It is very important that you go for next or copy number variation analysis using a technique such as multiplex ligation dependent probe amplification to pick up those 10 to 15% cases. In certain families, when you know the particular kind of deletion, you can design specific tests like quantitative PCR, long-range PCR, specific microarrays, if you know such a deletion in advance. But otherwise, for all practical purposes, start with next-gen sequencing, and if you have a high index of suspicion, go on for MLPA. So why are we so insisting on genetics? Genetics seems to have become very, very important in the last couple of decades. It is now increasingly understood that in X-linked Alport syndrome, and to a fair extent also in autosomal forms of Alport syndrome, there is a good genotype-phenotype correlation based on the type of variant that you find. So we talked about large changes such as large duplications or large deletions. Now these are shown to progress to kidney failure by 30 years in 90% cases. On the other hand, if you have not such large rearrangements, but they have frame shift or truncating changes, they would also similarly have high risk of kidney failure. Changes at the splice site have slightly lower risk, but they are also at high risk. But the missense variants tend to progress slightly slowly. So the missense, that is a single nucleotide kind of change, would progress to kidney failure by age 30 years in about 50% cases, such that the halfway time to developing ESRD would be 32 years. Now, most of these missense changes people have shown are occurring in certain glycine encoding codons. And glycine, when it is substituted by glutamine, arginine, or aspartate, those are those missense variants which are important. So if you come across a genetics report, try to look at what codon change has happened. And if it is a glycine being substituted by any of these, then probably it has carrying much more value than any other kind of change. In the autosomal Alport syndrome, similar genotype-phenotype correlations have been suggested for autosomal recessive forms, but clearly, given the plentitude of the disease, X-linked Alport syndrome, we have very clear correlations. There are a couple of things with regard to Alport syndrome of the autosomal kind that needs clarification. Here, we need to be very clear that it's not as if autosomal dominant, see, the same two genes are causing both autosomal dominant forms and autosomal recessive forms of disease. But herein, the key thing to understand is that the inheritance pattern determines what you're going to call it. So if the family history is suggestive of an autosomal dominant inheritance and a single pathogenic change in the COL4 A5, A3 or A4 has been found in multiple members, affected members of the family, then you can call it autosomal dominant Alport syndrome. On the other hand, if the disease is occurring in the same generation, like an autosomal recessive disease, in multiple siblings, and two changes are found in each of those individuals, and these changes could be homozygous changes or compound heterozygous changes. And when you say compound heterozygous, you mean there are two different changes, but they are on different alleles of the gene that is occurring in trans to each other. Then it would be considered as autosomal recessive inheritance. Now, in that circumstance, it's not as if the parent has an autosomal dominant disease. Parent carries that heterozygous change. Now, we are not going to use the word carrier anymore because that has a different connotation, and I'll just shortly come to that. Heterozygous presence of a variant that is known in an autosomal recessive Alport syndrome in a heterozygous state is not the same thing as autosomal dominant Alport at all. That must be very clear. And there has been no such correlation that, the severe kind of variants are associated with recessive disease or the less severe are associated with dominant disease. Such a genotype correlation has not been established. Another thing of importance that I can't dwell for lack of time on is that autosomal disease, autosomal dominant Alport syndrome, within the same family, different family members can have varied onset of symptoms. They can have varied rates of progression. And it is now understood that perhaps there are other modifying factors. Maybe there are additional things that are going on in certain other genes. Maybe there are additional changes in other sites, or maybe there are other modifying things like an IgA nephropathy concomitantly happening, or presence of certain FSGS causing genes that are present. These are now beginning to be shown as risk factors for progression in the context of an autosomal dominant disease. So overall, this slide summarizes what is the risk of kidney disease by the type of inheritance pattern. So as you can make out, I've just spoken to you about the time to kidney failure in context of X-linked Alport syndrome, but this slide further gives you a breakup of about boys and girls. So in boys with COL4A5 pathogenic change, you know that there's only one copy of the X chromosome and they do not have anything to protect them. Risk of kidney failure is 100%. The time to ESRD depends on the genotype that I discussed on the previous slide already with you. What about a girl? Now, in the past, girls who had the X-linked change, that is the siblings, say the sisters of boys with Alport syndrome or the mothers of boys with Alport syndrome, were termed carriers. Now we have moved away from that use of that term carriers, because when you say the word carrier, you connote that this disease, this person is not having disease. This person is just carrying a risk allele, but this person is not diseased. That has been shown to be not true. That has been shown to be not true in the context of females with X-linked COL4A5 changes. It has also been shown to be not true in the case of parents of, say, patients with autosomal recessive Alport syndrome. And in both contexts, we will not anymore use the word carrier state. So it's X-linked heterozygous female, and they have almost 1/4 risk of progression to kidney failure. This is a very considerable risk. It is nowhere like a carrier state. And this risk is very variable. This again, we don't understand why it happens, but patients, girls or women who develop, say, sensorineural hearing loss early on, or proteinuria they begin to show, or they have, if you were to biopsy them, they start showing basket weaving or lamelation or thinning and thickening segments, or they have gross hematuria. Those are the girls who are supposed to be at risk of disease progression faster than others who do not have these risk factors. In the context of Alport A3 and A4 genes, homozygous and compound heterozygous changes on 2 alleles in trans situation causes autosomal recessive disease. And that also has similar risk of kidney failure as X-linked Alport in boys. Again, genotype determines rate of progression. In the case of autosomal dominant disease, as I said, the disease is very, very variable. However, even in the presence of risk factors that I just discussed with you in the past, that there could be family history of disease, or there could be genetic modifiers on other FSGS genes or Alport genes, or there could be biopsy changes of IgA nephropathy, etc. In presence of risk factors, autosomal dominant disease tends to progress to kidney failure in up to 20% of cases. But in absence of any of these risk factors, it progresses in less than 1% cases. As I said, within the family, the phenotype can vary very much. So each of these patients who is carrying a change which is known to be associated with autosomal dominant Alport disease needs to be monitored carefully and to be looked for any presence of hematuria, proteinuria, because these will be markers of those patients who are likely to progress. What about diagenic inheritance? I just spoke to you that a person could be carrying 2 pathogenic changes, one on each allele in COL4A3 and COL4A4. That is going to behave, I'm sorry, this, the slide is incomplete. The last row should be reading, autosomal dominant, and the second last row should be reading autosomal recessive. So in the case of autosomal recessive, wherein there is diagenic inheritance with alleles having the changes in trans on 2 different alleles, there the rate is similar to autosomal recessive Alport. On the other hand, if the 2 changes are present on one single allele, because these 2 genes are on the same chromosome, then they behave like the same gene actually. So if they're present on the same allele, they behave like autosomal dominant or less than that. Now, there are many conditions which are inherited nephropathies, or they are related conditions which mimic Alport syndrome. Now, this list kind of lists some of the important ones. The most important one that comes to mind in context as causing confusion is the MYH9 gene. Now, MYH9 related renal disease is known to be associated with almost the same set of problems as is Alport. You can see that there is early onset end-stage renal disease in the 2nd decade of life, sensorineural hearing loss, there could be cataract, but there are additional changes in the blood cells such as thrombocytopenia with large platelets, leukocyte inclusion bodies known as Dole bodies, which kind of sometimes give away that this is MYH-related disease. However, these findings are not constant. So whenever faced with Alport syndrome, MYH9-related disease also should come in context, particularly if the disease pedigree is autosomal dominant. So autosomal dominant Alport phenotype, always think of MYH9 disease. And this has happened to us as well, that we have kept it in mind and it has turned out to be the cause. Other entities listed here are conditions which are associated with nephropathy, that is hematuria, renal disease which will be progressive in nature, which has hearing loss and could have additional findings. So you can see that there are a couple of tubulopathies also. So these are the tubulopathies which will not have hematuria, but they might progress to kidney failure, and they would have hearing loss. And therefore, you'll be confused as to whether if you have a patient presenting in end-stage renal disease and you don't know the cause, you don't historically can't go back to the urine to look for hematuria, then you better look at a cause. So in unknown CKD with hearing loss or other such findings, you must always go for genetics. So the kidney phenotype, that is the kidney problems in Alport syndrome, classically range from two ends of the spectrum, as you can see here. So a child could be having persistent microscopic hematuria, which is absolutely asymptomatic and stays asymptomatic all along and does not progress ever. Or a child could come to you with kidney failure. Now, these are such diverse phenotypes, and this is not just the presentation that I'm talking about, but also all along throughout their course of illness, that they could be diverse phenotypes. As said, this kind of depends a lot on the genotype as well as on the inheritance pattern. And it is the overall, the behavior of the disease, at least in the X-linked context and autosomal recessive context, tends to depend on the family history and how the other members have progressed as well. So while sometimes, you are evaluating a child for fever, etc., and you pick up some RBCs, and you tend to just repeat the urine routine later to check that the RBCs have indeed gone away, because you don't want to leave it like that. And when you find that there is persistent microscopic hematuria, you worry that what is this going on? So always worry over persistent microscopic hematuria, why this is persisting. On the other hand, there could be a context of a child with Alport syndrome and his siblings are being screened for the presence of renal disease. That is the other more common cause where you find asymptomatic patients. Sometimes they would be mildly symptomatic with puffiness, and then microscopic hematuria and proteinuria are picked up. Very rarely or uncommonly, there would be episodes of gross hematuria. So gross hematuria as such is not a very classic presentation for Alport syndrome. You worry about Alport more often when there is persistent microscopic hematuria than when a child presents to you with gross hematuria. Kidney failure, of course, is a very known presentation, particularly in the second decade of life for Alport syndrome. So again, this table summarizes for you what is the rates of these abnormalities in different forms of Alport syndrome. Microscopic hematuria is a constant feature of X-linked and autosomal recessive forms of disease. In autosomal dominant disease, it will not always persist, it will be intermittent. Hypertension and proteinuric chronic kidney disease, again, you will see that there are similarities between X-linked and autosomal recessive forms of disease, except in X-linked, the females with X-linked Alport would have relatively less severe disease, but even so, that disease appears to be more severe than in patients with autosomal dominant forms of Alport syndrome. So you can see that hearing loss is a feature of both X-linked as well as recessive forms, and also present in almost a quarter of females. So are the ocular abnormalities. One thing that has been increasingly recognized of late is that Alport syndrome is picked up now increasingly as a phenocopy of steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome. Now, while this is true of literature, it is also true of our own individual small experiences. First and foremost, Gast et al. Described that mutations in COL4, A3, A4, and A5, particularly A5, could be a common cause of adulthood onset FSGS. But even the Podonet registry from the Europe, which had almost data on almost 1,700 individuals with steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome, demonstrated that almost 10% of pediatric FSGS had underlying problems in the collagen 4 encoding genes. So do remember that patients who are presenting to you with steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome, frank hypoalbuminemia, massive edema, anasarca, and normal renal function, but with microscopic hematuria, might well turn out to be Alport syndrome. The problem in children additionally is that sometimes biopsy does not give you much information. When you do a biopsy for such a child, you would expect to see some excessive numbers of foam cells in the tubular interstitium. You might find focal segmental glomerular sclerosis. You might find more tubular interstitial fibrosis than is usual for, say, a child with minimal change disease. But beyond that, there are no specific leads. Even if you were to do an electron microscopy, the problem is that in childhood, the thickness of the glomerular basement membrane is known to be less than in adults. And so you have to compare them against the norms. And since the process of alterations in the glomerular basement membrane is a progressive one, very often the abnormalities in the GBM will be so focal that they might be missed. So unless enough gloms have been examined, it may be missed on even electron microscopy, particularly if your index of suspicion is not high. Couple of disorders that are related to Alport syndrome, that is X-linked Alport syndrome, but are not common, are these. One is the AMME complex, wherein there is mental retardation, facial dysmorphism, and RBC changes like eleptocytosis caused by a microdeletion of the entire collagen 4A5 gene and beyond it. On the other hand, sometimes there can be a deletion which is on the Col4A5 5' end and the adjacent Col4A6. However, when this deletion is just localized up to a breakpoint in intron 2, then that leads to a particular kind of a diagnosis of leiomyomatosis associated with Alport syndrome. So these are just benign smooth muscle tumors, and children would present with findings of Alport syndrome, but they would also have dysphagia. They would have vomiting, particularly after eating a large meal. They could have smooth muscle tumors elsewhere. So females could have genital tract tumors, and there could be recurrent cough, etc., because of tracheobronchial tree tumors. One important part of the entity of Alport syndrome is the eye changes. And it is so important to examine the eyes of patients with Alport syndrome. Particularly with X-linked Alport syndrome in boys and autosomal recessive forms of Alport syndrome, eye changes are quite common and pathognomonic. Now, eye changes are not very common. As you can make out, this particular change that you can see on the cornea, this is just an anterior lenticonus. It is in itself a very, very rare diagnosis. And if you find it, it must be Alport syndrome. This is how pathognomonic this entity is. The problem is that it is often mistaken for a cataract. It is present in 30 to 40% of adolescent boys and up to 15% girls with X-linked Alport syndrome, but usually appears only in the second decade of boys. So if you're evaluating an Alport-like adolescent, always look for this eye change. It is not present in almost uncommon in autosomal dominant forms of Alport syndrome. Likewise, we look at just the anterior chamber and we forget about the posterior part of the eye. The retina gives another very, very specific clue to the diagnosis of Alport syndrome. There's a dot and fleck maculopathy going on. And if you were to look at just, you can look at this retina picture, and this retinal image shows that there would be some small yellowish, flakish deposits on the perimacular area. And this again is highly specific for Alport syndrome, particularly X-linked or autosomal recessive forms. It is best detected by the presence of this retinopathy. Maculopathy is detected by retinal OCT. So in good centers, this should be possible to carry out. Other changes are these: corneal vesicles and recurrent corneal erosions. Unless you ask for these changes to be looked at, the ophthalmologist may not know what you're asking for. One important kind of advice would be always examine the moms. By the time the boys, in adolescent, are presenting to you with Alport syndrome, their moms would usually have the maculopathy or the lenticonus. They would not have it in early childhood, but by the time that they are in their 40s, they would have these changes very often. What about hearing loss in Alport syndrome? Again, collagen chains are important in helping the organ of Corti adhere to the basilar membrane. The type of hearing loss that you see is high frequency, that is high tone hearing loss, sensorineural hearing loss, which is bilateral. And it is usually apparent only by adolescents. So you can look at this kind of another summary table, which indicates at what age, what proportion of patients would have hearing loss in X-linked Alport syndrome. Again, as you can make out, females would present much later, and only a fraction of females would have hearing loss. In autosomal recessive Alport syndrome, the risk of hearing loss is there, but it is less than in X-linked Alport syndrome, or so it seems. In dominant forms, probably it is almost non-existent. Diagnosis of X-linked Alport syndrome for years has not had access to genetic diagnosis. And it's only now that we are increasing using genetics. So what have been the signs that have been used to diagnose Alport syndrome? In a child who has presented to you with hematuria, proteinuria, and chronic kidney disease, presence of a family history in an appropriate pedigree, that is an X-linked, which would mean that uncles are affected, maternal uncles are affected, or maternal grandfather had end-stage renal disease, and likewise in autosomal dominant, you would have inheritance over the upper generations. So that has high sensitivity for a diagnosis of Alport, and obviously very specific for Alport as well. However, about 10 to 12% of cases are de novo changes. That is, they had no mutation and only happened in the first time in this particular index case. Hearing loss and lenticonus central fleck retinopathy, these would have high to variable sensitivity, but they are highly specific for, at least the eye changes are very, very specific for Alport syndrome. The hearing loss is not specific for Alport syndrome. As you already saw the list of mimics, many conditions can mimic Alport syndrome in having hearing loss. So while it is highly sensitive, it's not specific for Alport syndrome. The presence of a lamellated glomerular basement membrane, indicating several layers of the glomerular basement membrane, is highly sensitive as well as specific for Alport syndrome, but caution must be there that it could be a focal process in childhood. Now, one thing that we very often tend to rely on, especially in our country, is immunostaining for collagen. And people have done skin biopsies for immunostaining for collagen. Now, if you recall the cartoon that I had shown, wherein I had shown to you how skin has certain forms of collagen here. So you can see alpha 5, alpha 6 trimers are present in the skin, and alpha 3, 4, 5 is present in the kidney. So you would expect that if alpha 5 chain is absent, you would expect that this patient would also have absent alpha 5 chain in the skin. And if you were to provide do a skin biopsy and you were to just look at immunostaining for alpha 5 chain, if it's absent, it could indicate to you the presence of Alport syndrome. Now, this is not always true. And this is not always true because of the fact that you do know that sometimes the chain might be present but not functional in some way, and staining might just happen. And in other forms of Alport, which do not require alpha 5 chain to be mutated, that is the Col4A3 types and the Col4A4 types, therein there is no utility for looking at skin immunostaining. So I'll go back to the slide that we were at, and we talk about staining in the biopsy in the same way that we talk about staining on the skin biopsy. And sorry, I've kind of lost on my slide, I think. Yeah, this is where we were. So the most important and highly specific and sensitive test overall now has become genetic testing, and demonstration of a pathogenic variant in Col4A5 has the highest kind of prediction for X-linked Alport syndrome. But there is a risk of misclassification. Just as I said, if you don't use ACMG criteria, you might be attributing pathogenicity to variants which are not important at all. That is variants of unknown significance. And as I said, if you don't do a second change, if you were to miss deletions and duplications that can be picked up on other techniques, then you would be missing the diagnosis of genetics here. What about Alport syndrome in girls and women? I briefly touched upon this just before now, and I told you how X-linked Alport, they are no more called carriers, but they are called Alport syndrome in females. And therefore, it's very important to understand that even women can be affected. This slide kind of summarizes how the disease differs between women with autosomal recessive and X-linked forms. As expected, autosomal recessive form will not be different between boys and girls, and the disease is going to be more severe in women with autosomal recessive Alport syndrome. But women with X-linked Alport syndrome would also progress in a fair proportion of cases. So in fact, it has been said that the true carrier status is there only in 5% of women. So 95% of women would develop some form of kidney disease as the time goes by. So it could be just hypertension, proteinuria, hematuria, but they would develop disease. As I said, up to 25% would progress to end-stage renal disease. Now, this is a very important consideration to keep in mind when you are going forward for transplantation. So overall, nomenclature has changed over the years. We have moved away from using terms that used to suggest very benign forms of the disease, such as a carrier status, or use of the term thin basement membrane nephropathy, which was derived from thin GBM disease, which was derived from benign familial hematuria. And these are now replaced by the appropriate terms based on the inheritance pattern. So to read more, you have this unified classification that has come out in Kidney International in 2018 that you could refer to. So overall, whether you should do genetic testing or rely on other methods, what is the advantage of genetic testing? You confirm the diagnosis, and it also gives you important information that helps you prognosticate, because the type of genetic variation indicates the risk of progression or the rate of progression, how fast the progression would happen. It also helps you screen siblings and other relatives. It helps you predict whether and plan future pregnancies in the family, because the mother needs to be tested and then need to look at the fetus in prenatal testing. And in the future, probably it will provide us an opportunity for personalized treatment. Limitations are that 10% of patients would not have mutations that get detected, and some variants would be of uncertain significance. Most importantly, knowing that you have a disease might preclude you from getting benefits of insurance in certain systems. So indications overall, this is a very important slide because this indicates to you what are the indications for genetic testing for variants. Persistent glomerular hematuria, along with any of these clinical findings, or presence of family history that indicates Alport, or findings on kidney biopsy that indicate Alport, or in a context of steroid-resistant FSGS, always plan for testing for these genetic forms. Overall, an approach could be that if you have a setting in which you test and then you find a pathogenic cause, then you manage its Alport syndrome. And if you don't find a cause, you look further by a kidney biopsy. And then if the findings suggest you might have missed the diagnosis in genetics and manage as Alport syndrome, if they indicate something else, then you manage differently. Overall, this slide summarizes the key evaluations to carry out for patients with Alport syndrome of any type. Kidney disease has to be screened for on basis of proteinuria, renal function, and frequency of evaluation depends on the type of kidney disease and the state at which it gets diagnosed. Management relies heavily on ASERBs and management of along the principles of chronic kidney disease. At transplantation, one has to be careful about donor selection and post-transplant nephritis I'll come to shortly. Vision and hearing requires screening, particularly beginning for hearing at 6-7 years of age and in adolescents for vision. Cardiac evaluation is necessary once to look at echocardiography features because collagen 5 is also present in the vessel wall GBM, and therefore some cases are associated with aortic dilatation, particularly if collagen A4/6 is type 6 is involved, then concerns of leiomyoma should also be looked at. Genetic consultation is of pretty much importance for sibling screening, prenatal testing, and donor selection. So overall, people for trial purposes have categorized Alport syndrome into 4 categories: just hematuria, microalbuminuria, gross proteinuria, or impaired renal function. But when do you intervene? So there is a strong evidence now collected over the decades that favor the use of ACE inhibitors. Now this slide from the European Registry of Alport syndrome indicates that if you were to look at patients who had the same kind of genetic disease severity, the genotype matched patients, and you looked at the stage at which you intervened with ACE inhibitors, then you can see that as compared to no treatment, which is the red line and climbs fastest and shows the highest rate of kidney failure with median age at 22 years. If you intervene even at late stages of disease, you are managing to postpone renal failure. So ACE inhibitors seem to delay the time to kidney failures in cohorts matched by genotype and for time for intervention. So even in presence of sort of, you can look at the slide that even in the presence of severe most disease progression is postponed by 3 years. That is if you had CKD stages 3-4. So what about children? People have shown that this is not children's data, but overall the registry data. But if you look at untreated siblings and treated siblings, so one sibling got the medicine and the other did not get, then the time to progression with the same genotype has changed by almost 13 years, median time to progression, if you have untreated sibling pairs. Life expectancy certainly improves from a median of 55 years to pretty much better. So expert guidelines now recommend that RAS blockade is the cornerstone of treatment. In X-linked females, in the males, you start treatment once diagnosis is made, even before proteinuria sets in, particularly in the presence of a positive family history of early onset end-stage renal disease. In girls, however, you start when some manifestation of kidney disease begins to happen because you know that the rate of progression is very, very variable. In autosomal recessive, the principles are the same as X-linked boys. Other principles would be to avoid ototoxic medications and industrial noise exposure to protect the hearing. So overall, this is just a cartoon from a past publication of the group of Alport's registry of Europe, and they indicate that you try to detect it early and you intervene early if there is proteinuria. However, at that time there was not enough evidence to recommend treatment with ACE inhibitors in an asymptomatic non-proteinuric state. So overall, this again summarizes the same, that in the presence of a family history, a boy who does not have any manifestation, you would still consider intervention. On the other hand, in the absence of a family history, you could probably hold it out. Overall, the choice of therapy relies on ACE inhibitors and ARBs, and a trial is currently ongoing, and hopefully the results are almost going to come out now, which is looking at patients who are fairly asymptomatic with just hematuria and no proteinuria, and looking at ACE inhibition versus placebo. These are various other strategies that are being examined in context of Alport syndrome to look at how renal failure might just be delayed in the context of Alport syndrome. So these are non-specific strategies, more or less. Then there are a couple of agents that are specifically looking at modifying the milieu of the glomerular basement membrane through the Cardinal trial and the HERA trial, which are looking at certain specific markers in the pathogenetic pathway to see whether progression can be delayed. Last couple of slides, we have to be very careful when screening parents or other related people for donation. One would be very, very reluctant to take a mom as a donor for an X-linked Alport syndrome. She should not be taken as a donor, and she should really be the very, very last choice. But even if she is more than 45 years of age, asymptomatic, no hematuria, no proteinuria, normal hearing, still there is a risk of kidney failure that she should understand. However, if any of these things are present, hematuria, proteinuria, sensorineural hearing loss, she is not a candidate. Certainly younger women are not a candidate because they would begin to manifest much later. In case of autosomal recessive forms of disease, again screen with the same sincerity. There's a small risk of post-transplant nephritis in the context of Alport syndrome. Anti-GBM disease is described. Now, antibodies will form in the context of COL4 alpha 5 changes in which the chain is absent from the kidneys. You can imagine that if a child has progressed to ESRD with Alport syndrome, that has caused the COL4A5 chain to not be expressed at all in the kidney basement membrane. For the body, when the new kidney brings in with it the COL4A5 chain, it is a new antigen, and therefore the body mounts an immune response by building up antibodies against it. And in that case, almost up to 30% of such cases where large, bigger kind of deletions or nonsense mutations have caused the chain not to be expressed at all, 30% of cases would mount antibody response. Only a small proportion would develop frank nephritis, but it is important to screen for this nephritis through monthly screens in the first year after transplantation. And if you pick up nephritis with hematuria, proteinuria, renal dysfunction, do a biopsy and start plasmapheresis and intense immunosuppression. So in a nutshell, Alport syndrome requires a high index of suspicion in various settings. Diagnosis is increasingly based on genetics, continues to rely on biopsy and clinical findings. We must rule out mimics, and that would be usefully done through genetics. There is a large variation in disease presentation and progression according to the inheritance pattern and the genotype. Early institution of therapy appears to be beneficial in delaying time to kidney failure. Genetic counseling has an important role in various settings, including sibling screening, prenatal testing, through choice of donors, and overall prognostication of the index patient himself. ASERPs are the cornerstone of therapy, and transplantation is very much feasible, but donor selection has to be careful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking us through the journey of Alport syndrome in children. It was very interesting. Next, we'll have the polling session. I request both the speakers to hold on for 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll move on to the question and answer session after the polling session is done for the participants. I request all the participants to put their questions in the question and answer section. So the instructions of the polling session is the participants are requested to enter their proper email IDs and contact numbers during the process of registration for the ease of future communication. And we have already done with 4 polling sessions, and we are left with 3 more. Today we have a polling session as well. And each polling session will have 10 questions, and out of 10 questions, we have 3 star questions. Total duration is 8 minutes for the polling session, and we will have 3 star questions as already said. And the cumulative score for all 7 polling sessions will be taken as final mark for selecting the winners. And only trainees are allowed to participate in the polling session, and request all participants to log in on time using the bigger screen. And so we'll move ahead with the polling session. We'll go up to the question and answer section. Manisha ma'am, Aditi ma'am, you're there?
Yes, yes.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah.
We just have a couple of questions. Have you observed hypernatremia in patient with COVID-related kidney disease?
So there are different reports, and many types of electrolyte abnormalities have been reported. And in pediatric sector, we have had a couple of reports reporting hypernatremia as well as other electrolyte disturbances in the intensive care unit. But it is not a specific manifestation of COVID. It can occur and has been seen in some of the reports. Even in the adult patients, it has been known to be there. But you cannot call it a specific manifestation. It can occur in COVID in intensive care.
Okay, fine, ma'am. And the next question is to Dr. Aditi Sinha. In your experience in India, what is the percentage of steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome with underlying genetic etiology who have COL4 mutation?
Yeah, my experience is limited, but overall, when we are doing it as part of the DBT collaborative collection of data on the genetic basis of primary steroid resistance, it does appear to be a very important entity. So it is one of the common genes that are affected. So hopefully we'll have that data together soon.
Okay. And the few other questions like to Manisha ma'am, what is the precaution to be taken in a child with CKD who is on hemodialysis and he is positive for COVID?
Okay, so if we have the third wave, we'll get more and more experience. So now we have clear-cut guidelines how to dialyze patients in the hemodialysis unit. Initially, in beginning of COVID pandemic, all of us were very scared. I mean, how to go about and all that. But clear-cut guidelines have been published. And what has to be done is, like, if the patient is COVID positive already, then he should be dialyzed, he or she, in a COVID positive unit preferably. And if you don't have a separate COVID positive unit, the guidelines say that he can be dialyzed in your own unit, maybe in the last shift, or you place the bed of the child so that while coming and going, the child is not exposed to others. But now we have designated COVID positive dialysis units where it can be done. You have to follow the same precautions in the COVID positive unit. The staff takes universal precautions and standard precautions, wearing PPE and all those things, and face masks are to be used by the children. The bed spacing is important. The hand sanitization is important. When the child enters, leaves the unit, and then it's better not to, most of these children would have to be admitted for dialysis because you can't let them go home and come back in public vehicles or for that matter in any other vehicle. So COVID positive children, even if they are not critically ill, we admit them during the course of positivity. Generally, they become negative by 10th day or 11th day. They become non-infected, even if not negative. So after 10th or 11th day, we let the patient go home. So that's how it's followed. And in the COVID negative unit also, you have to follow all precautions so that you don't get COVID into the unit by triaging at the entry. So those things are important. And the good thing would be WHO guidelines are there, and Indian Society has also published guidelines for management of COVID positive patients as well as COVID negative patients. So there are clear-cut guidelines on that now. So best thing is to segregate COVID positive and COVID negative. That's what we do.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. And the next question is to Dr. Aditi. What is the percentage of Alport syndrome landing with CKD in children? I think already you mentioned in your slides, but it has come as a question.
Yeah, I mean, percentage of Alport syndrome landing as CKD in children would be dependent entirely on the setting in which you are in, isn't it? Because, I mean, you may see Alport syndrome only when you start trying to diagnose it. So, I mean, for example, if we look at our own patients, more than half of them are diagnosed after progress to chronic kidney disease, but the other half are, asymptomatic hematuria or steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome or sibling screening. So I have already told you about the time to progression, etc. I think that part is addressed. And if you look at overall the commonality of Alport syndrome as a cause of chronic kidney disease, disease, it is the second most common inherited cause of end-stage renal disease. The first most common being polycystic kidney disease. We don't see much of it, as much of it as, say, adult physicians would. But among the inherited diseases, Alport is the second most common cause.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. And the next question is there any difference between ACI and ARBs to be used in Alport syndrome?
Overall, the cumulative experience in the world through, say, ESCAPE trial and other studies, many other studies specifically looking at ACE inhibitors, is more with ACE inhibitors. If you look at non-Alport context also in chronic kidney disease, there is overall more evidence for ACE inhibitors usage than there is for ARBs. When people have meta-analyzed that information in the context of generally not Alport, sometimes no differences have been found. But as you saw that Pediatric Nephrology 2013 review article, pediatricians are more comfortable starting on ACE inhibitors as the first-line therapy, given the more experience with their usage. And if there is dry cough or other contraindication, then moving on to an ARB.
Okay, fine.
Dr. Manisha might comment more if she wants to.
Yeah, so I agree with what Dr. Aditi has already said. And as for the latest guidelines in adults, ACE and ARBs, they are now placed on equal footing. So initially we had ACE, and then if intolerant to ACE, go to ARBs, but in adults, not for Alports, I'm talking generally. So either of them can be used. And it is said that, for example, in diabetic population, type 1, go for ACE inhibitors, type 2 diabetic nephropathy, go for ARBs. So as of now, the latest guidelines, hypertensive guidelines, they have put ACE and ARBs on equal footing. Don't combine them after the on-target trial, but you can use either of them.
Yeah, this is very important that to reduce proteinuria, we do not combine them because combinations have lots of side effects.
Okay. Manisha ma'am, the other question is, what is the percentage of cardiac involvement in COVID-19 children?
So I'm not a cardiologist to comment on that. But roughly with whatever people we are seeing in our unit, the cardiac abnormalities are common. They come in the form of arrhythmias, myocarditis, heart failures because of myocarditis. So these things are common. And then because COVID is a prothrombotic state, we have seen acute coronary syndromes as well in context of COVID-19. So going by the cardiologist experience, the abnormalities, like for example, rhythm abnormalities and myocarditis seem to be quite common. And most of the protocols in hospitalized sick patients, anticoagulation is one of the standards of care in COVID-19. I'm talking about the hospitalized patients. Yes, that's important. So they're quite common. If you screen for them, especially doing ECG and all that, they are common.
Okay, I think we are done with the questions as well. It was really a great session with two eminent speakers. It was with full of knowledge. Thank you so much, Manisha ma'am. Thank you, Aditi ma'am. It was all about the practical aspects
of all your patient hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much from our side. And Dr. Aditi's talk also I really enjoyed. Thank you, Dr. Aditi.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Talevani. It was really